let's talk about the foot and the hip connection. I haven't chatted on that in stories other than the posts that Betsy and I have been putting out together. And we really wanted to break them down into small pieces so that they can be digestible and actionable for you. But the main takeaway is there's lots you can focus on at the foot itself and at the ankle itself, and as well as at the hip itself. But how do we put all those together in the kinetic chain to understand why, even though maybe we're focusing on our foot, why we're not seeing changes in our functional activities. And so if you're a butt clencher and you're supinating all the time, you're going to find that you will roll that hip out. And so what we need to do is create movement into the opposite direction, which is internal rotation. So if you're always doing clamshells and stuff like that, think about in your exercise program, are you ever going the opposite direction? And the other important takeaway is the fact that we need to be able to do both. We need to both supinate and pronate in the gait cycle, because supination will give us rigidity of the foot, which we need when we want to push off or propel ourselves. But when we want to pronate or flatten that foot, that gives us shock absorption, and that is important in mid-stance of gait phase. And so without having to go into all of the nitty-gritty, we basically need to be able to move in and out of supination, pronation, supination. And so both of those available ranges of motion at the hip also need to be available. So the first exercise that we love from Zach Couples involves having that heel slightly elevated, because that will help us to shorten the distance from that arch so that we can work on flattening. As we hinge the hips back, and hinging the hips back will help us promote internal rotation at the hips. If you're somebody who has a hard time hinging, you might really want to hone in on your internal rotation. That could be the reason why you're rounding at your back. We're not getting the innominate, and I don't have a hip in this, obviously, a hip to move together. So that's why we wanted to share the hinging exercise first. And then today, the rationale kind of proceeds as reduce tension in the glutes, reduce tension in the pelvic floor, create new space into internal rotation, strengthen to hold that new space. So if we're always like this, can we create strength for that pelvis to stay a little bit more open? That will reduce tension on the pelvic floor. That will help create internal rotation for single leg stability, which is important in things like walking and running. Now, if you are a runner, I want you to consider that running is an ongoing single support activity. So what happens in running is we need to move through supination and pronation in the gait cycle as we are switching from leg to leg, which means single leg stability and internal rotation and pronation go hand in hand. And so that's why single leg exercises are really vital. One, so we can create support on the lateral part of the hip so that we can maintain a stable pelvis and not transmit forces irregularly and create other issues. But also the fact that that hip needs to find a slight internal rotation so we can pronate and absorb shock and forces. So if you maybe have been struggling with your running form and gait, or you find your symptoms of your pelvic floor are worse after running and you're trying to put the pieces together, I want you to think about some of these concepts and consider how that could be happening in running. I also wanted to continue the conversation on prolapse. I had some of you message me and say, yes, that you had prolapse surgery and it did indeed fail, and you had not been aware of pressure control or ever had it mentioned to you, especially by your surgeon, and wish you had. And so that is one part of the conversation that goes into surgery, is there's about a 30% failure rate. But I do want to say this. There is a study that shows even though the surgery failed and the people have some stage of prolapse, that their symptoms were still not as severe as previous. And you can take a lot away from that and try to figure out why that is. But there is about a 30% failure rate, which isn't super high. It's not really low either. And I think that's important to know going in. There is some evidence that in things like hysterectomy, where we're changing like the structural integrity of how everything works together, that we have less integrity even with a surgical intervention, and that could be why there's failure. There's lots that goes into it, obviously, right? considering what age you are when you consider this type of surgery. If you're super young, yeah, I would push you for conservative management, because if there's a certain failure rate, and we know we haven't even hit menopause yet, when there's changes in hormones and all the other things, something you would just want to push off as long as you could, just like a joint replacement or anything else like that. But to me, this lack of communication on the pressure system and how it affects prolapse is like an orthopedic doing a joint replacement on somebody who's very overweight and not having the conversation about how weight. Needless to say, there's no easy button or band-aid in life, and that's probably true across the spectrum in whatever you're talking about in life. So I just want you to just kind of have this better picture of this conversation that's just not one-sided. And so you can advocate for yourself. Like, even if you do need surgery, wonderful. I'm so glad we have options like that can help you when everything else has not worked out. But also that you feel empowered to say, listen, I still would like to give this a try for a few visits so I can have a better understanding. You can get some enlightenment as to things you could and should be doing after surgery. There's tons of wealth to be gained from a few visits. And so just really advocating for yourself again for that. And just knowing that movement and nutrition and mindfulness, all these things are just as powerful things in your life that you need to focus on too.